In 2013, the Vermont Senate took the historic step of being the first legislative body in the country to pass the bill to permit people diagnosed with a terminal illness to request regulated medical assistance to hasten their own death. The bill that would become Act 39 was reported on the Senate floor by my predecessor, the then senior senator from Addison, Senator Claire Ayer. Madam President, may I read from Senator Ayer's 2013 bill report?
You may.
To quote, the goal of this legislation, patient choice and control at end of life, is to allow dying Vermonters more autonomy and control during their final days. It allows them to participate on their terms and in the way they lived their lives. They can involve their families and take comfort that their suffering will end quickly. They can create a harmonious, loving, peaceful passage at the end of their life and ensure that anyone seeking doesn't have to die alone, and that everyone who participates is on solid medical and legal basis. It is a bill to bring more choice and control to mentally competent, terminally ill Vermonters and face the final stages of the dying process. Madam President, 9 years later, based on the experience of many Vermonters and their families, the goals articulated by Senator Ayer in presenting the original bill being achieved, enabling more people choice, control, and peace at the end of their lives. Act 39 was largely based on Oregon's 1994 death with and requires a strict multi-stepped process to prevent abuse by medical providers and others, and to ensure informed patient decisions about options. Act 39 allows Vermont physicians to prescribe medication to a Vermont resident with a terminal condition with the intent that the medication be self-administered for the purpose of hastening the patient's death. Act 39 sets forth conditions for the patient and the physician for this action to be taken lawfully. These conditions include, but are not limited to, an oral and written request by the patient to the physician, instruction that all steps in the process must be voluntary, ensuring that the patient be capable of making such a decision, confirmation of the diagnosis and prognosis by a second Vermont physician, and an attestation that to these steps by a non-interested witness. The process also includes the provision of information, verbally and in writing, of diagnosis and prognosis, treatment options, feasible end-of-life services, including palliative and hospice care, range of results and risks of taking the medication, and that the patient may rescind the request for medication at any time. Once the prescribing physician fulfills all the statutory requirements, the physician must report to the Department of Health that all steps have been taken. The filing of the report confers immunity on the physician from professional, criminal, or civil liability associated with the treatment of the patient for the hastening of the patient's death. According to the January 15th, 2022 biannual report from the Department of Health, from May 2013 to June 2021, 116 Vermonters had taken advantage of the provisions of Act 39 for the purpose of hastening their own death. As required by the law, all of these individuals had been diagnosed with a terminal illness, including 77% with cancer, 11% with ALS, 5% with neurodegenerative conditions, and 7% with other terminal illnesses. On average, just fewer than 15 Vermonters per year have used the Act 39 medical aid in dying provisions to hasten their death. Others may start the process but not finish it for a variety of reasons, including that their quality of life remains acceptable or because they become too ill to participate. There have been no validated reports of abuse since the passage of Act 39. The passage of Act 39 and ensuing support, education, and advocacy have also improved the overall knowledge of end-of-life choices and services in Vermont. According to a 2021 Department of Health report, use of hospice services has increased 26% since 2013, and now nearly half of all people dying in Vermont use these services. Vermont was the first state to enact a medical aid in dying law by legislative action, and the second state overall to have such a law, as Oregon passed the law by ballot initiative in 1994. Now, 11 states, including the very large California, have such a law. Thus, both here in Vermont and nationally, much has been learned about the process and results of these laws. Many patients and their family members have reported that the law and process have provided them with comfort and control during an extremely difficult time. However, over the almost 9 years since its inception, several provisions have been identified that are unclear or overly onerous for people during their final stages of life. Thus, S.74 proposes to make very modest changes to the process and clarify provisions of the law for certain medical professionals. So let's turn to the language of the bill, which can be, as the Madam President said, found on page 262 of today's calendar. Section 1 includes a couple new definitions that are used in updating the bill, including a clarification of the meaning of healthcare services and a definition of telemedicine that may be used in some clinically appropriate instances. And this definition of telemedicine is consistent with the definition used in other parts of the statutes. Section 2 updates the requirements for a patient requesting medication to aid in the patient's death to allow for the oral request to be made in person or by use of live audio and visual telemedicine. If the physician determines that the use of telemedicine is clinically appropriate. The requirement remains that 2 such oral requests by the patient must occur at least 15 days apart, and all legal provisions related to patient consent and use of telemedicine apply. Experience has shown that by the time a patient reaches the point to request medication to aid in their death, it may be physically difficult for them to travel to meet a physician in person. For people in more remote parts of the state, the distance to their physician may require several hours of travel, which may cause suffering for people already weak and in pain. Particularly over the past 2 years, the use of telemedicine has become easier to access and acceptable to use, and both patients and doctors have become more adept with the technology. At the same time, clinical practice has determined when telemedicine is and is not appropriate. Thus, S.74 allows for the use of telemedicine using both audio and visual when clinically appropriate to request medication to aid in dying. Section 2 also clarifies that the physician prescribing the medication to aid in a patient's death must determine that a patient is suffering from a terminal condition based on both the patient's medical records and a physician's physical examination of the patient. This section also removes a provision that requires that the physician wait 48 hours to write the prescription after these 2 oral requests and offering an opportunity to rescind the request. In practice, this 48-hour waiting period has not proved necessary and has prolonged the suffering of patients who are ready to hasten their own death and created an unnecessary weight and burden for patients and families during an extremely difficult and painful time. Finally, this section makes language regarding the patient and physician non-gender specific. No other changes to the strict 15-step process required by Act 39 for prescribing medicine to hasten death are made. Section 3 of the bill clarifies that no physician nurse, pharmacist, or other healthcare provider would be subject to civil or criminal liability for acting in good faith compliance with the law. The current law makes this clear for physicians and is implied for other medical providers. S.74 makes it explicit for all healthcare providers. This is particularly important because only one pharmacist in the state, located in Rutland, currently provides medication for medical aid in dying due to liability concerns, creating access challenges for patients in many areas of the state. Section 4 states that the bill will take effect on passage. The committee vote was 4-0-1 in favor of the bill, and we heard from a number of witnesses, including a professor of family medicine and palliative care at the Porter Medical Center, advocates for Patient Choices Vermont, Compassion and Choices, and Vermont Right to Life, staff members at the Attorney General's Office and the Department of Health, as well as Blue Cross Blue Shield Vermont, and of course our own legislative counsel and the sponsor of the bill, the senator from Windsor, Senator McCormick. As many of you know, the former majority leader of the other body, Willem Jewett, died last week at the age of 58. Just over a year ago, Willem was diagnosed with a rare cancer, mucosal melanoma. And after many months of fighting, his condition deteriorated to the point where last month, he began the process of requesting medication to hasten his own death. And just days before his death, Willem advocated for the passage of S.74, saying that in practice, he found some of the Act 39 restrictions on patients and providers, particularly the 48-hour waiting period and multiple in-person requests, to be obstructive and, quote, completely meaningless. Madam President, if I may quote from an article in VT Digger about Willem Jewett's death.
You may.
Willem states, if anyone wants to suggest that I or anyone else who's gotten to this stage hasn't thought long and deeply about this, and if they've made the request, hasn't done it with information or at the end of the day, conviction, they're crazy. It's the fundamental authority of the individual over the most fundamental decision they'll make in their life. It becomes simple if you accept that premise. Willem died with the help of medical aid in dying, surrounded by family and friends on the very day that your Health and Welfare Committee began work on S.74. As many of you know, Willem Jewett was a friend of mine. I've known him since our college-age daughters were in preschool together and served on a school board with him for several years. He lived just up the mountain from me, which in Vermont makes us neighbors too. Willem was an incredible human being. And as a member of the other body, Willem Jewett worked hard to pass Act 39 in 2013, not knowing that he himself would use the law in 2022. So today, Madam President, I ask the Senate to pass S.74 in memory of Willem and his incredible life. Thank you, Madam President.